People always assume that when something breaks in a marriage, it's slow, a gradual decay of love, passion, trust. But that's not how it was for me. One day, I was Sylvia Andrews, a 65-year-old retiree with a quiet life, a predictable husband, and a routine that bordered on boring but comfortable. The next day, I was someone else entirely. You see, what happened wasn't gradual at all. It didn't build over years of resentment or neglect. No, it came crashing down on me all at once in a way I could never have anticipated. One day, my husband George sat me down in our living room and suggested something that would unravel everything I thought I knew about him and about myself. I can still hear his words, that calm, calculated tone. What if you spent time with other men, younger men? I thought he was joking at first. I laughed, not realizing that my entire world was about to shift. But George wasn't laughing, and in the weeks that followed, I would come to understand just how far he was willing to push me, to humiliate me. I never wanted to be with anyone but George, but he didn't care about what I wanted. He wanted something else, something darker, and he was willing to destroy us both to get it. So here I am, sitting in the aftermath of it all, looking back on the choices I made, the young men I was pushed into meeting, and wondering how I let it go so far. Wondering how George, the man I had trusted for so long, could have turned our marriage into something so twisted. And the worst part? It's not over yet. When you're married for as long as George and I were, people stop asking about the little things. They assume you've got it all figured out, that you've reached some kind of marital equilibrium. And for a long time I thought we had. George and I met when we were both in our 20s. He was ambitious, hard-working, and always seemed to know exactly what he wanted. He climbed the ranks quickly at the firm he worked for, becoming one of the most successful financial planners in our town. I, on the other hand, chose a quieter path. I spent over 30 years as a librarian at the local high school, a job that suited me perfectly. I loved books. I loved the peace and quiet of the library, and I loved helping students discover the magic of reading. For most of our marriage, George's success allowed us to live comfortably. We had 2 children, Sarah and Andrew, both of whom had long since moved away to start families of their own. Our house, a modest colonial on the outskirts of town, became quiet after they left, and George and I settled into a routine. We had the kind of marriage people assumed was solid, predictable, sure, but solid. But looking back now, I see the cracks. The signs were there, but I didn't notice them at the time. George had always been the dominant one in our relationship. He made the decisions, handled the finances, and I was happy to let him. I thought that was just the way things worked. In the early years, George's assertiveness was part of what attracted me to him. He had a way of taking charge that made me feel safe, like he always had everything under control. But over time, that control became more stifling. He began to dictate what I wore, where we went, who we spent time with. If I wanted to go out for lunch with a friend, George needed to know every detail, where we were going, how long we'd be, who else would be there. It was subtle at first, almost caring, but over the years it became more rigid. I didn't go anywhere without consulting George, and when I did, I felt guilty, as if I were betraying him somehow. I told myself it was normal. After all, we had been married for decades. Wasn't it natural for a husband to want to protect his wife, to keep an eye on her? But George wasn't just protective, he was controlling. And then, about a year ago, things started to shift in a way I couldn't quite understand. It started with the way he talked to me. George had always been a bit dismissive, but now it was different. He'd make little comments about how I dressed or how I looked, small things, but they stung. "You've put on a few pounds," he'd say, or, "That dress isn't as flattering as it used to be." At first I brushed it off. I wasn't young anymore, and I didn't expect to look like I did when we first got married. But George's comments became more frequent, more pointed. Have you ever thought about dyeing your hair? Maybe wearing something a little sexier? I didn't know how to respond. What was sexy at 65? I wasn't interested in trying to look younger or attract attention. But George seemed to have other ideas. One night we were sitting in the living room, and out of nowhere, George brought it up. You ever wonder what it would be like to be with a younger man? I stared at him, shocked. What? You know, he continued, his voice casual as if we were talking about the weather. You've always been curious about those young athletic types, haven't you? I laughed, thinking it was a joke. George, come on. I'm 65 years old. What are you talking about? But George didn't laugh. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and said, I think you should try it. It might spice things up. I felt a knot form in my stomach. You can't be serious. I am, he said, his voice firm. Think about it. It's something different, something exciting. I was speechless. George had always been controlling, but this was something else. Why would he suggest such a thing? What was he trying to achieve? That night I couldn't sleep. George's suggestion played over and over in my mind, and I couldn't make sense of it. Why would he want me to be with someone else? Was he testing me? Was this some kind of twisted game? For days I avoided the topic, hoping it would go away, hoping George would forget about it. But he didn't. He brought it up again and again, each time pushing me a little further, planting the idea deeper in my mind. At first, I resisted. I told him I wasn't interested, that the idea was ridiculous. But George was persistent, and over time I started to feel worn down. The more he pushed, the more I began to question myself. Was he right? Would it really be such a terrible thing? After all, it wasn't like I had been looking for something outside our marriage, but George was giving me permission, wasn't he? And that's when everything began to unravel. Once George had planted the idea, it was like a seed that slowly started to grow, despite my efforts to uproot it. I'd find myself replaying his words, the suggestion that I experiment with younger men. It was so absurd, so unlike anything I ever imagined for myself, but George didn't let it fade. He began to introduce the idea subtly into our everyday conversations. He'd make offhand comments about younger men we saw while out shopping or eating at restaurants. I started to notice how he lingered when we passed groups of young men, especially African American men, tall and athletic, working in the gym or playing basketball in the park. You've always liked the strong athletic type, haven't you? He'd whisper, almost teasingly. At first I tried to ignore him. I would laugh nervously, change the subject, or brush him off, but his persistence wore me down. It wasn't just the words. There was something in George's eyes, something dark that made me uncomfortable. I wondered what he was getting out of it. Why was he pushing me toward this? Then one night, George came home from his usual poker game with a look on his face that I didn't recognize. His eyes sparkled with something I hadn't seen in years, and he seemed excited. He poured himself a drink and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. Sylvia, he began, his voice soft but insistent. I've been thinking about what we talked about. I didn't need to ask what he meant. I already knew. George, I've told you. I'm not interested. I don't want to be with anyone else, especially not... I trailed off, unsure how to even finish the sentence. He leaned forward, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. What if I arranged it for you? Something safe, something discreet. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. I'll make sure it's exactly what you need. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. George, this is crazy. I'm your wife. Why are you doing this? His smile faded and his expression grew serious. Because I want you to experience it, Sylvia. I want you to see what it's like. And maybe, just maybe, it'll bring something back to us. We've been stagnant for years.
This is our chance to change that." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to shout at him, to demand that he stop this madness. But another part of me, one that I wasn't proud of, was curious. I hated to admit it, but George's persistence had worked its way into my mind. I wasn't interested in other men, but there was something about the way he spoke, the way he framed it, that made it seem possible. George seemed to sense my hesitation because he reached across the table and took my hand. "Just one time," he said, his voice soothing. "Let's try it. If you hate it, we'll never speak of it again." I looked at him, trying to read the expression on his face. Was this really what he wanted? Why? But before I could form a response, he continued. "There's someone I know, a young man from the gym. His name is Isaiah. He's respectful, clean, and he understands discretion. I've already spoken to him, and he's willing to meet with you. No pressure, just a drink. If you don't feel comfortable, you can walk away." The room seemed to spin for a moment as I tried to process what George was telling me. He had already arranged it? He had talked to this man? My heart raced, and I felt a lump form in my throat. But before I could protest, before I could shut it all down, George leaned in and whispered, "You might enjoy it more than you think." That was the moment I felt something crack inside me. I didn't know if it was the weight of all the years I had spent living under George's control, or the strange mix of fear and curiosity, but I didn't say no. The next evening, George told me he had set up a meeting with Isaiah at a quiet bar on the edge of town. It was a place we had been to before, dimly lit, with a few booths in the back where we wouldn't be disturbed. I tried to convince myself that this was all just an experiment, something that would blow over quickly. But as I got ready, I felt a knot of anxiety growing in my stomach. I chose a modest dress, something I'd wear on any regular night out. I didn't want to look like I was trying too hard. I wasn't trying to impress anyone, at least that's what I kept telling myself. George seemed excited as he drove me to the bar. He kept glancing at me, his smile wide and unsettling. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice almost tender. "Isaiah's going to be very impressed." I swallowed hard, staring out the window as we neared the bar. My mind was racing, and I couldn't believe I was actually going through with this. I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold in front of me, like I was an observer in my own body. When we pulled up to the bar, George parked and turned to me. "I'll pick you up in a couple of hours," he said, leaning over to kiss my cheek. "Just relax. Enjoy yourself." I nodded, unable to speak. My hands were shaking as I stepped out of the car and made my way inside. The bar was just as I remembered it, dark, quiet, with a few regulars scattered at the counter. I made my way to the back, my heart pounding in my chest, and there, sitting in a booth, was Isaiah. He looked younger than I had imagined, maybe 25, with broad shoulders and a confident smile. His skin was dark and smooth, and there was an ease about him that made me feel immediately self-conscious. He stood up as I approached, extending his hand. "Sylvia, right?" he said, his voice deep and warm. "It's nice to meet you." I took his hand, my palms sweaty and trembling. "Nice to meet you too," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. We sat down, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I could feel my heart racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. Isaiah seemed to sense my discomfort because he smiled and said, "Relax, I know this is different, but we can just talk, no pressure." I nodded, grateful for his kindness. For the next hour we talked, about our lives, our interests, anything to fill the silence. Isaiah was charming, easy to talk to, and before I knew it, I found myself laughing at one of his jokes. For a brief moment, I forgot why I was there. I forgot that George had sent me. But then, as the night wore on, Isaiah leaned in closer, his hand brushing mine on the table. "You're beautiful, Sylvia," he said, his voice soft. I can see why George wanted us to meet. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was the moment George had orchestrated, the moment where I was supposed to cross the line. And despite the fear, despite the guilt swirling inside me, part of me wanted to.
That night with Isaiah felt surreal, like I had stepped into a life that wasn't my own. I wasn't the Sylvia Andrews I had been for the past 40 years. I was someone else, someone George had molded, pushed, and prodded until she didn't know which way was up anymore. After we left the bar, Isaiah offered to walk me to my car. I hesitated, glancing around the empty parking lot, half expecting George to appear out of the shadows. But he wasn't there. It was just me and Isaiah, the cold night air wrapping around us like a cocoon. "Are you okay?" Isaiah asked, his voice gentle. I nodded, even though I wasn't. I didn't know what I was doing, or why I was even considering going through with this. But there was something about Isaiah, his kindness, his patience, that made me feel safe. And maybe that's why I let him kiss me. It was just a kiss at first, soft, tentative, like he was testing the waters. But as soon as our lips met, something inside me shifted. All the guilt, all the fear, all the uncertainty melted away, and for the first time in years, I felt wanted, desired. Isaiah pulled back, his eyes searching mine. "We don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with," he said, his voice low and steady. But I didn't stop him. I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned in, pressing my lips to his again, my hands trembling as I wrapped my arms around him. We ended up at a small motel just outside of town, a place where no one would recognize us. As we walked into the room, I felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. This was it. This was the moment George had been pushing me toward, the moment I had fought against for so long. Isaiah was gentle, patient, and as we lay together in that small, dimly lit room, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't love. It wasn't even really passion. But it was something I hadn't felt in years. It was the feeling of being seen, of being touched, of being wanted. But when it was over, and Isaiah left me alone in that cold, empty room, the reality of what I had done hit me like a freight train. I had crossed the line, and there was no going back.
The drive home after that night with Isaiah was one of the longest of my life. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, and my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. What had I done? How could I have let things go this far? When I pulled into the driveway, the house loomed in front of me like a monument to my failure. George was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, his eyes focused on the newspaper in front of him, but I could feel the tension in the air. He didn't look up when I entered, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe he didn't care. Maybe he wouldn't ask. But then, as I walked past him, he spoke. "How was it?" His voice was calm, casual, as if he were asking about the weather. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know how to respond. How could I possibly explain what had just happened? "It was fine," I whispered, my voice barely audible. George looked up then, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Just fine?" I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. "Yes." He stared at me for a long moment, as if he were trying to read my mind, trying to see what I was hiding. Then, slowly, he smiled, a small, satisfied smile that made my stomach turn. "I'm glad you enjoyed yourself," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I couldn't bring myself to respond. I felt dirty, used, and worse. I felt like I had betrayed myself. This wasn't who I was. This wasn't the life I wanted. That night, As I lay in bed next to George, the guilt settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating me. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the night in my head, the kiss with Isaiah, the way his hands had felt on my skin, the way I had let myself be pulled into something I didn't want. But it was too late. I had already crossed the line, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, I tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, but everything felt different. I couldn't look at George without feeling a surge of resentment. He had pushed me into this, manipulated me, and now he was acting as if it were all perfectly normal. He didn't bring it up again, at least not right away, but I could feel the shift in our relationship. It was as if something had broken between us, something that could never be fixed. And yet, George seemed content. In fact, he seemed more attentive, more affectionate than he had in years. He would kiss me on the cheek in the mornings, ask about my day, and even bring home flowers from time to time. It was as if he believed that by pushing me into the arms of another man, he had somehow rekindled our marriage. But I knew the truth. Whatever we had before was gone, and I didn't know if we could ever get it back. I thought that after Isaiah, things would go back to normal. I thought that George had gotten whatever twisted satisfaction he needed from the experience, and that we could move on. But I was wrong. George wasn't done. Not by a long shot. It started a few weeks after that night. George came home one evening with a smile on his face, the same unsettling smile he had worn the night he first suggested I be with another man. I knew something was coming, but I didn't know what. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting down across from me at the dinner table. "You enjoyed your time with Isaiah, didn't you?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. The memory of that night still made my stomach churn. George took my silence as agreement. "I think it's time for you to meet someone else." My heart dropped into my stomach. "George, no, I can't. I don't want to do this again." But George wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind. "I've spoken to someone," he continued, his voice calm and measured. "His name is Jamal. He works as a delivery driver. You've seen him around, haven't you?" I had. Jamal was in his early 20s, tall and muscular, with a friendly smile that had always seemed harmless. But now, the thought of being with him made my skin crawl. "George, I can't," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please don't make me do this." George's expression hardened. "I'm not making you do anything, Sylvia. This is for you. I thought you wanted to feel desired again. I thought you wanted to experience something new." Tears welled up in my eyes as I shook my head. "I don't want this. I just want things to go back to the way they were." But George wasn't having it. He stood up from the table and walked over to me, placing his hands on my shoulders. "You're going to do this, Sylvia, and you're going to enjoy it." I wanted to scream, to push him away, but I felt trapped. George had complete control over me, and I didn't know how to break free. The meeting with Jamal was arranged for the following week. I dreaded it with every fiber of my being, but I didn't see a way out. George had made it clear that this was what he wanted, and I was too weak to fight him. The night of the meeting, George drove me to a small cafe on the other side of town, far enough away that no one we knew would see us. Jamal was already there when we arrived, sitting at a table near the back, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I sat down across from him. Jamal was friendly, easy to talk to, and he seemed genuinely interested in me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being used by both him and George. We talked for a while about nothing in particular, his job, my retirement, the weather. But I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken expectation hanging between us. After an hour or so, Jamal leaned in and smiled. "You're beautiful, Sylvia," he said, his voice soft. "I'm glad we got to meet." I forced a smile, my heart pounding in my chest. Thank you. Jamal reached across the table and took my hand. His touch was warm, comforting, but all I could think about was George sitting at home, waiting for me to follow through with his twisted plan. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to be with Jamal, but I felt powerless to stop it. When we left the cafe, Jamal walked me to my car, just as Isaiah had. He kissed me, gently at first, and I let him. But unlike with Isaiah, there was no part of me that wanted this. I felt numb, detached, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. We ended up at the same motel, the same room, and just like before, I went through the motions, too afraid to say no, too broken to fight back. When it was over, Jamal kissed me on the cheek and thanked me for the evening, as if we had just had a pleasant dinner. But I felt hollow inside. I wasn't the same person I had been before all of this began. George had taken something from me, something I wasn't sure I could ever get back. After my night with Jamal, something inside me began to change. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that this was normal. George had pushed me into a world I didn't want to be a part of, and I was losing myself in the process. I avoided George as much as possible in the days that followed, retreating to my bedroom or spending time with friends whenever I could. I felt like a stranger in my own home, constantly on edge, waiting for the next time George would bring up another man, another affair. I couldn't go through it again. I wouldn't. But George didn't seem to notice my growing distance. If anything, he seemed pleased with himself, as if his plan to push me into these relationships had been a success. He would smile at me over breakfast, ask how I was feeling, and even compliment me on how radiant I looked. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much I hated what he had done to me, but I didn't have the strength. I felt weak, powerless, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Then, one afternoon, as I was sitting in the living room, lost in my thoughts, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before getting up to answer it. When I opened the door, I was shocked to see Sarah, my daughter, standing on the porch. "Sarah?" I said, my voice filled with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Sarah smiled and stepped inside, giving me a hug. "I was in town for a meeting and thought I'd stop by. It's been too long, Mom." I forced a smile, trying to hide the turmoil I was feeling. "It's good to see you," I said, leading her into the living room. "Can I get you something to drink?" She shook her head and sat down on the couch, her eyes scanning the room. "How's everything been? You look tired." I felt a pang of guilt. I hadn't been myself lately, and I knew it was showing, but I couldn't tell Sarah the truth. I couldn't let her see how far things had spiraled out of control. "I'm fine," I lied, sitting down across from her. "Just a little tired, like you said. Nothing to worry about." Sarah didn't seem convinced. She studied me for a moment, her brow furrowed in concern. "Is everything okay with Dad? You seem different." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't tell her the truth, not about George, not about what he had pushed me into. But I couldn't keep lying to her either. "It's been difficult," I admitted, my voice shaking. "But I'm managing." Sarah reached out and took my hand, her eyes filled with sympathy. "Mom, if there's something going on, you can tell me. You don't have to go through it alone." For a moment I considered telling her everything. I wanted to unload the weight I had been carrying for so long, to finally share the truth with someone. But I couldn't. The shame was too much. "It's nothing," I said, pulling my hand away. "Just the usual ups and downs of marriage. Nothing I can't handle." Sarah didn't push me any further, but I could tell she didn't believe me. She stayed for a while longer, making small talk, but the tension in the air was palpable. When she finally left, I felt both relieved and heartbroken. I had kept my secret, but I had also pushed away one of the few people who cared about me. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, pretending that everything was fine while my life fell apart around me. I needed to find a way out. Just as I had feared, George wasn't done with his twisted game. A few weeks after my meeting with Jamal, he brought up the idea of me seeing someone else. I had been dreading this moment, knowing it was only a matter of time before he pushed me toward another affair, another betrayal of myself. This time, the man he had in mind was Darius, a 28-year-old personal trainer who had recently moved to town. I had seen him around, tall, handsome, with the kind of physique that drew attention wherever he went, but the idea of being with him made my stomach churn. When George suggested I meet with Darius, I felt a surge of panic. I couldn't do this again. I couldn't let George push me any further. "George, please," I begged, my voice trembling. "I don't want this. I don't want to be with anyone else." But George was unmoved. "You've done it before, Sylvia. You know the drill. Just meet with him. See where things go." I felt trapped, cornered. I didn't know how to say no. George had taken so much from me already, my sense of self, my dignity, and I didn't know how to fight back. The meeting with Darius was arranged for a Friday evening. George drove me to a small restaurant in town, the same one we had been to countless times before. I could barely eat, my stomach twisted in knots, but George didn't seem to notice. He was all smiles, acting as though this was a perfectly normal evening. When we arrived at the restaurant, Darius was already there, sitting at a table near the back. He stood up as we approached, his smile warm and welcoming. "Mrs. Andrews," he said, extending his hand, "it's a pleasure to meet you." I shook his hand, my heart racing. "Please call me Sylvia." We sat down, and for the next hour we talked. Darius was charming, easy to talk to, and he seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all wrong. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to be with him. After dinner, Darius offered to walk me to my car, and I hesitated for a moment before agreeing. We walked in silence, the cool night air wrapping around us. When we reached my car, Darius turned to me, his expression serious. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, Sylvia," he said, his voice soft. "If you don't want this, we can stop." For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of control. I could stop this. I could walk away. But before I could make a decision, George's voice echoed in my mind, pushing me forward, reminding me of the power he held over me. I kissed Darius, just as I had kissed Isaiah and Jamal before him. And just like before, I felt nothing but emptiness. After my night with Darius, I knew I couldn't continue living like this. George had pushed me to my breaking point, and I was no longer the woman I had once been. I felt hollow, broken, like a puppet being controlled by someone else. The days blurred together after that, each one feeling like a continuation of the last. George seemed content, as if everything was going according to plan. But I was spiraling, and I didn't know how to stop it. Then one evening, as George and I were sitting in the living room, something inside me snapped. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I couldn't keep playing along with his sick game. "George, I want a divorce," I said, my voice shaking but firm. George looked at me, his expression unreadable. "What are you talking about?" "I can't do this anymore," I continued, my heart pounding in my chest. "I can't keep living like this. You've pushed me too far, and I'm done." For a moment, George didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his eyes dark and cold. Then slowly he stood up and walked over to me, his face inches from mine. "You're not going anywhere, Sylvia," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can just walk away after everything I've done for you? After everything we've been through?" I stood my ground, refusing to back down. "Yes, I'm leaving, George, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." His expression twisted into a sneer. "You'll regret this, Sylvia. You'll regret leaving me." But I didn't care anymore. I was done living in fear. I was done letting George control me. Leaving George wasn't easy. After 40 years of marriage, the thought of starting over was terrifying. But I knew it was the only way to save myself. I packed my bags while George was at work, leaving a note on the kitchen table explaining everything. I didn't know what his reaction would be when he found it, but I couldn't stay to find out. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, far away from the life I had once known. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of freedom. But the scars George had left on me wouldn't heal overnight. I spent weeks, even months, trying to piece myself back together, trying to find the woman I had been before all of this began. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I wondered if I would ever truly be whole again. Sarah and Andrew were supportive, though they didn't fully understand what had happened. I didn't tell them everything. I couldn't. The shame was still too much. But they knew enough to know that I had made the right decision in leaving George. As for George, he didn't take the divorce well. He fought it every step of the way, trying to manipulate me into coming back, trying to guilt me into staying. But I stood my ground. I had spent too many years living under his control, and I wasn't going to let him dictate my life any longer. Now, as I sit in my small apartment, looking out at the world beyond, I realize that I've survived. George didn't break me, though he came close. I'm still healing, still learning how to live on my own, but I'm free. And that's something George can never take away from me. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what George put me through, or if I'll ever trust anyone again. But I do know that I'm stronger than I ever thought I was. I've come through the fire, and though I'm scarred, I'm still standing. I wanted to escape George's control, and I did. But it came at a cost. I lost pieces of myself along the way, pieces that I may never get back. But I'm learning to live with that. I'm learning to move forward, one step at a time. And for now, that's enough.
Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. At 74, I thought I'd seen it all: love, loss, joy, and heartbreak. I believed I was safely settled into the calm, uneventful rhythm of old age. My days were spent in the quiet solitude of my countryside home, surrounded by paintings, the soft hum of my record player, and the distant sound of birdsong. I'd convinced myself I was content, that I didn't need anything more from life. But then Matthew arrived. Matthew is my nephew, my younger sister's son, and he came to stay with me after his life fell apart in ways that felt far too familiar. A failed marriage, a career at a standstill. He arrived at my doorstep with nothing but a duffel bag, a weary smile, and a defeated look in his eyes. I welcomed him without hesitation. I had the space, after all, and it wasn't as though I had much else going on. At first, his presence was a comfort. He brought a liveliness to my quiet home that I hadn't realized I was missing. We shared meals, long conversations, and moments of genuine connection. He reminded me of a version of myself I thought I'd lost long ago, vibrant, curious, and endlessly hopeful. But then something changed. It started small, a lingering glance, a touch that lasted just a second too long. At first I told myself I was imagining things. He was my nephew, after all, young enough to be my son, struggling and vulnerable, looking to me for guidance. There was no reason to think there was anything more to it than that. But late one night, as I sat alone in my studio with a glass of wine in hand, I heard his footsteps outside the door. "Olivia?" His voice was soft, hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if he should be there. "Come in," I called, setting my glass down and turning to face him. He stepped inside, his face illuminated by the warm light of the desk lamp. There was something in his eyes I couldn't quite place. Something that sent a shiver down my spine and made my pulse quicken in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, the course of my life shifted. This is a story about choices, about the lines we draw for ourselves and what happens when we cross them. It's about loneliness, longing, and the unexpected ways our lives can spiral out of control when we let our guard down. If you're willing to listen, I'll tell you everything. The truth about what happened that night and the nights that followed. I'll tell you how it all began and how it all fell apart. I never imagined myself living alone. Daniel, my husband of nearly 40 years, was supposed to grow old with me in this house. It was our dream, a modest but charming home in the countryside, surrounded by rolling hills and lush gardens. When he passed away 10 years ago, everything changed. I retreated into myself, finding solace in painting and the predictable comfort of routine. Each day was the same. Coffee in the morning, a stroll through the garden, and hours spent in my studio. My work kept me grounded. Landscapes, still lifes, portraits, all created with the careful precision of someone trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense to them. Friends would visit occasionally, my sister Karen among them. She'd sit at my kitchen table, sipping tea and telling me about her son, Matthew. "He's brilliant," she'd say, her eyes shining with pride. "But he's lost, Olivia. He just hasn't figured out where he fits yet." Matthew was a distant figure in my life, someone I saw at holiday gatherings or heard about through Karen's stories. As a boy, he was precocious and curious, always asking questions and scribbling stories in a worn notebook. As an adult, he became a successful novelist, publishing 3 books by the time he turned 30. But his personal life was less stable. Karen called me one afternoon, her voice strained with worry. "Matthew's not doing well," she said. "His marriage is over, and he's struggling to write. He needs a change of scenery, somewhere quiet where he can clear his head. I was hoping he could stay with you for a while." I hesitated. It wasn't that I didn't want to help, I just wasn't sure how to navigate sharing my space with someone again after so many years alone. But Karen sounded so desperate, and I couldn't bring myself to say no. "Of course," I told her. "He's welcome here." When Matthew arrived, I was struck by how much he had changed. The confident, charismatic young man I remembered was gone, replaced by someone quieter, more subdued. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He carried a single duffel bag, the rest of his belongings left behind in the city. "Hi, Aunt Olivia," he said, forcing a smile. "Matthew," I replied, pulling him into a hug. "It's good to see you." His room was ready, a cozy space overlooking the garden. I'd filled it with fresh flowers and a stack of books I thought he might enjoy. He seemed genuinely touched by the gesture, thanking me with a sincerity that made me feel both appreciated and sad for him. At first, we kept our distance. He spent most of his time in his room, working on his laptop or staring out the window. I gave him space, unsure of how to approach him in his obvious state of despair. But as the days turned into weeks, we began to find a rhythm. I'd cook dinner, and he'd join me in the kitchen, offering to help chop vegetables or set the table. We'd sit together, eating in companionable silence or discussing trivial things like the weather or the latest book he was reading. Slowly, he began to open up. "I feel like I've lost everything," he admitted one night, his voice heavy with emotion. "My marriage, my career, it's all fallen apart." I reached across the table and placed my hand on his. "You haven't lost everything, Matthew. You're here. You have a family who loves you, and you're young enough to rebuild." He gave me a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Aunt Olivia. I don't know what I'd do without you." As the weeks went by, our bond grew stronger. We began taking walks together in the mornings, exploring the trails that wound through the hills behind the house. He'd tell me about his childhood, his writing, and the dreams he once had, but wasn't sure he could achieve anymore. "You're so talented, Matthew," I told him during one of our walks. "You've already accomplished so much. Don't give up now." He looked at me with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "You make it sound so easy," he said, "but it's hard to see the good in yourself when everything feels like it's falling apart." I understood his pain more than he realized. After Daniel died, I felt much the same way. Adrift, unmoored, unsure of who I was without him. But I had found my way back through my art, and I wanted to help Matthew find his way too. One evening, I invited him into my studio. "This is where I spend most of my time," I said, gesturing to the canvases lining the walls. It's my sanctuary. He walked around the room, studying my work with an intensity that surprised me. These are incredible, he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. You've captured so much life. Hearing him say that stirred something in me, a sense of pride I hadn't felt in years. Thank you, I said softly. Art has always been my way of making sense of the world. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. I think I need to find something like that again. Something that makes me feel whole. It was during these moments that I began to notice a change in him. He seemed lighter, more present, as though the weight he'd been carrying was beginning to lift. But along with that change came something else. Something I couldn't quite name. It was in the way he looked at me sometimes, his gaze lingering a second too long. Or the way he'd reach out to touch my arm when he laughed, his hand warm against my skin. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than affection, a sign of the closeness we'd developed. But as the days went on, I couldn't ignore the way it made me feel. One afternoon, we were sitting on the porch, sipping tea and watching the sun set over the hills. The conversation had turned to Daniel, and I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't with anyone since his death. He was my best friend, I said, my voice tinged with both sadness and warmth. We built this life together, and losing him, it felt like losing a part of myself. Matthew reached over and took my hand, his touch gentle but firm. You're incredible, Aunt Olivia, he said. I hope you know that. Everything you've done, everything you've been through, you're so much stronger than you realize. His words took my breath away. I looked at him, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that made my heart race, a mixture of admiration, longing, and something else I couldn't quite place. I quickly pulled my hand away, trying to steady myself. Thank you, Matthew, I said, forcing a smile. But the moment lingered, unspoken but undeniable. From that day on, the dynamic between us shifted. The easy camaraderie we'd developed was still there, but beneath it was an undercurrent of tension. I found myself more aware of him, of the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way his presence seemed to fill the room. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into things. But late at night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he made me feel. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, he stopped me in the kitchen. Can we talk? He asked, his voice hesitant. Of course, I said, turning to face him. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with what to say. Then finally he spoke. I want you to know how much you mean to me, he said. You've been so kind, so patient. I don't know what I'd do without you. His words were filled with emotion, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. You don't have to thank me, Matthew. I'm happy to have you here. But the way he was looking at me, intense, searching, made it clear that there was more he wanted to say. Matthew, I began, my voice trailing off. Before I could finish, he took a step closer, his hand brushing against mine. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I didn't want to name. It was a quiet autumn evening, when the boundary between us blurred in a way that could never be undone. The day had been uneventful, the kind of day that slips by unnoticed in the comforting monotony of routine. Matthew and I had spent the afternoon in the garden, clearing away the last remnants of summer. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and the soft light of the setting sun cast a golden glow over everything. As we worked, Matthew seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him in weeks. He laughed easily, his earlier melancholy replaced by a warmth that was contagious. You have a knack for this, Aunt Olivia, he said, gesturing to the neatly trimmed hedges and freshly turned soil. It's like you've created your own little world here. I smiled, wiping my hands on my gardening gloves. This place has been my refuge. It's kept me grounded, especially after. My voice trailed off, and he nodded, understanding without me having to say more. That evening after dinner, he poured us each a glass of wine, a habit we had fallen into since his arrival. We settled into the living room, the fireplace crackling softly in the background. The house felt warm, cozy, and safe, a stark contrast to the growing unease I felt within myself. It started innocently enough. We talked about books, as we often did. He had been rereading a favorite of his, The Great Gatsby, and we debated its themes, love, ambition, and the elusive nature of happiness. It's tragic, really, he said, swirling the wine in his glass. Gatsby spent his whole life chasing a dream that was never real to begin with. I nodded, thinking of my own life and the dreams I had let go of over the years. Sometimes it's easier to hold on to the idea of something than to face the reality, I said softly. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. Do you ever feel like you've settled, Aunt Olivia? Like you gave up on something you wanted? The question caught me off guard. I took a sip of wine, stalling for time. I don't know, I admitted finally. I suppose there were things I wanted that didn't happen, but I don't regret the life I've had. It's been meaningful. Meaningful, he repeated, his tone contemplative. That's a good word for it. I think I've been chasing the wrong things my whole life, and now that I've lost them, I'm not sure what's left. I reached out, placing my hand on his. You're still young, Matthew. You have time to figure it out. His hand tightened around mine, and for a moment the air between us shifted. It wasn't until later, when I was alone in my studio, that I realized how much that moment had unsettled me. I tried to focus on the canvas in front of me, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Matthew. The way he had looked at me, the warmth of his hand on mine. I told myself it was nothing. A fleeting moment of vulnerability. Nothing more. But then I heard footsteps outside the door. Olivia? His voice was quiet, hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if he should be there. Come in, I said, setting my brush down and turning to face him. He stepped inside, his face illuminated by the soft light of the desk lamp. There was something in his eyes, an intensity that made my pulse quicken. Is everything okay? I asked, trying to sound casual. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know, he admitted. I needed to talk to you. Of course, I said, gesturing for him to sit. He didn't sit. Instead, he took a step closer, his hands fidgeting nervously at his sides. I don't know how to say this, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. But I feel like everything in my life is falling apart, and you're the only thing that makes sense right now. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he closed the distance between us. Aunt Olivia? His voice broke, and for a moment he looked so vulnerable, so lost, that I couldn't bring myself to stop him when he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, soft, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. The kiss was brief, lasting only a moment, but it felt as though time had stopped. When he pulled back, his eyes were filled with both fear and longing. I'm sorry, he said quickly, stepping back. I shouldn't have. It's okay, I interrupted, my voice trembling. You're going through a lot right now. I understand. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. What had just happened wasn't okay, and I didn't understand it. Didn't understand the feelings it had stirred within me. He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I'll go, he said, turning to leave. Matthew, wait. I wasn't sure why I stopped him. Maybe it was because I didn't want him to leave like that, filled with shame and regret. Or maybe it was because a part of me didn't want him to leave at all. He turned back, his expression unreadable. You're not alone in this, I said softly. Whatever you're feeling, we can figure it out together. For a moment, he simply stared at me as though trying to decide whether to believe me. Then he nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. We didn't talk about what had happened, but the tension between us was palpable. Every glance, every touch, every shared moment was charged with an unspoken understanding. I found myself more aware of him than ever before. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the way his presence seemed to fill the room. It was as though the kiss had opened a door I hadn't even realized was there, and now I couldn't close it. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills, he broke the silence. Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? He asked, his voice quiet but steady. I looked at him, surprised by the question. What do you mean? I mean, do you ever feel like you've made so many compromises that you don't even recognize yourself anymore? I thought about Daniel, about the life we had built together. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the dreams I had let go of. And for the first time, I allowed myself to admit that yes, there were times when I felt exactly that way. Yes, I said finally. I think everyone feels that way sometimes. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I don't want to feel like that anymore, he said. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way he had looked at me, the way his words had made my heart ache with both longing and fear. I knew what I was feeling was wrong. He was my nephew, my sister's son. But in that moment, he wasn't just my nephew. He was a man, vulnerable, lost, and searching for something I wasn't sure I could give him. And for the first time in years, I felt alive. The kiss might have been brief, but its impact lingered in every corner of my home. I couldn't shake the memory of it. The warmth of his lips, the raw vulnerability in his eyes, and the way my own pulse had quickened against all reason. But now, in the cold light of day, guilt wrapped itself around me like a suffocating shroud. Matthew was my nephew, and no matter how fractured or desperate we both felt, what had happened was a mistake. For days, we avoided each other. Matthew stayed in his room, only emerging to grab a cup of coffee or a plate of food. I busied myself with my painting, but the strokes on the canvas were aimless, chaotic. I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept circling back to him, to that moment, and to the unspoken tension that now hung between us like a thick fog. It was on the third day that he finally broke the silence. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of tea growing cold in my hands, when he walked in. He looked hesitant, his usual confidence replaced by something tentative and unsure. "Morning," he said, his voice low. "Good morning," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my voice trembled slightly, betraying the turmoil beneath the surface. He sat across from me, his hands clasped together on the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was almost unbearable. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Aunt Olivia, about the other night?" I held up a hand, stopping him. "Matthew, we don't need to talk about it. It was a mistake, a moment of confusion." He flinched at my words, his jaw tightening. "Is that all it was to you? A mistake?" I stared at him, taken aback by the hurt in his voice. "What else could it be?" "I don't know," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the table. "But it didn't feel like a mistake to me. It felt real." His words sent a jolt through me, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Matthew, you're going through a difficult time right now. You're vulnerable, and I should have been more careful." "Careful?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You think this is just about vulnerability? About me being lost? Isn't it?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his eyes blazing. "You think I don't know what I'm feeling? That I'm just some broken kid clinging to the first person who's been kind to me? This isn't about that, Olivia. It's about you." "Me?" I echoed, stunned. "Yes, you," he said, his voice softening slightly. "You're incredible, and you don't even see it. You've built this beautiful life for yourself, and you've been so kind to me, so understanding. You make me feel alive." His words left me breathless, but they also filled me with dread. This wasn't something we could explore. It wasn't something that could be. "Matthew, I care about you," I said carefully. "But this can't happen. It's not right." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the pain in his eyes. "I understand," he said finally. "I'll pack my things and leave." "Matthew, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "Staying here will only make things worse for both of us." That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the weight of his words pressed down on me. Part of me wanted to stop him, to tell him to stay, that we could figure this out together. But another part of me knew he was right. The next morning, he was gone. The house felt unbearably empty without him. For weeks, I wandered from room to room, unable to shake the silence that seemed to echo in his absence. I tried to lose myself in my art, but every canvas I started ended up abandoned, a mess of colors and lines that went nowhere. I tried to distract myself with chores, with books, with visits to friends, but nothing worked. I missed him. One afternoon, as I was weeding the garden, my phone buzzed with a message from Karen. "Matthew's staying with a friend in the city," it read. "He said he needed time to sort himself out. Thank you for looking after him, Olivia. I don't know what he would have done without you." I stared at the message, my heart aching. If only Karen knew the truth. As the weeks turned into months, I began to find a fragile sense of normalcy. I returned to my painting, though my work had taken on a darker, more introspective tone. My friends noticed the change in me but said nothing. sensing that I wasn't ready to talk about it. And then one day I received a letter. The envelope was plain, with no return address. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Matthew's. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, my hands trembling slightly. Dear Olivia, I hope this letter finds you well. I've thought about writing to you 100 times, but I never knew what to say. Even now, I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing. But there are things I need to say, and I hope you'll understand. First, I want to apologize for putting you in an impossible position, for making things so complicated. I know I crossed a line, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I also need you to know that what I said that night was true. You've been an anchor for me, a source of strength and comfort in a time when I felt like I was drowning. You've reminded me of the kind of person I want to be, and for that, I'll always be grateful. I've started seeing a therapist, trying to untangle the mess I've made of my life. It's not easy, but it's a start. And I've started writing again too. For the first time in years, it feels like the words are coming from a place of truth, rather than a need to impress or please others. I don't know what the future holds, but I hope we can both find peace in our own ways. You deserve happiness, Olivia. Please don't ever forget that. Thank you for everything. Matthew, I read the letter twice, tears streaming down my face. His words were a bittersweet reminder of everything that had happened and everything that could never be. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, alongside other mementos of my life. It was a piece of my story now, one I would carry with me always. The house no longer felt empty. It felt quiet, yes, but also full of memories, both painful and beautiful. I returned to my art with renewed focus, pouring my emotions onto the canvas in a way I never had before. And though the ache of what had happened still lingered, I found solace in the knowledge that we were both trying to heal, each in our own way. Months passed, and the sharp edges of what had happened began to dull, though the memories still lingered like faint shadows in the corners of my mind. The days grew shorter as autumn gave way to winter, and I found myself retreating more into my art. Painting became my therapy, a way to process everything that had unfolded without needing to speak a word of it to anyone. My paintings changed during this time. They became more abstract, filled with swirling colors and shapes that seemed to dance between chaos and order. Friends who visited my studio commented on the shift, marveling at the intensity and emotion in my work. You've tapped into something deep, Olivia, one of them said. It's like you've found a new voice. They were right, though I didn't tell them why. The events of those months had broken something in me, but they had also revealed something I hadn't known was there. A strength, a resilience, and a capacity to feel deeply, even in the face of pain. Karen called me frequently, updating me on Matthew's progress. He's doing better, she said one evening. He's been seeing a therapist and he's writing again. I think he's finally starting to find his footing. That's good to hear, I replied, my voice steady even as my heart ached. She hesitated before continuing. I don't know what you said to him while he was with you, but whatever it was, it helped. He's different now. Stronger. I didn't know how to respond to that. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I had helped him or hurt him more. Winter was harsh that year, with snow blanketing the countryside and frost creeping across the windows. The house felt colder than usual, though I couldn't tell if it was the weather or my own lingering sense of emptiness. One particularly cold morning, as I was sipping tea by the fire, I received a package in the mail. It was from Matthew. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling slightly. Inside was a book, a first edition of The Great Gatsby, one of the novels we had talked about so often during his stay. Tucked inside the front cover was a note. Olivia, I saw this and thought of you. Thank you for everything, for your kindness, your patience, and your wisdom. You mean more to me than I can put into words. Take care of yourself. Matthew, I held the book in my hands, running my fingers over the worn cover. It was a simple gesture, but it brought tears to my eyes. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of closure, a small but significant step toward healing. The days began to grow longer again, and with the arrival of spring came a sense of renewal. The garden came back to life, the flowers blooming in vibrant colors that seemed to echo the emotions I had poured into my paintings. I started venturing out more, reconnecting with friends and attending local art shows. My work was well received, and I even sold a few pieces, something I hadn't done in years. It felt good to share my art with others, to let it speak for me in ways I couldn't. One afternoon, as I was tending to the garden, Karen called with news. "Matthew's publishing a new book," she said, her excitement evident even over the phone. "It's coming out this summer. He says it's the best thing he's ever written." "That's wonderful," I said, genuinely happy for him. "He wanted me to tell you," she added. "He said you were the one who helped him find his way back to writing." I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me felt a surge of pride, while another part felt the familiar ache of loss. The summer brought with it a flurry of activity. Karen invited me to the city for the launch of Matthew's book, but I declined. I wasn't ready to face him yet, not in person. Instead, I sent him a letter, brief but heartfelt. "Matthew, I'm so proud of you. Congratulations on your new book. I know it will be as brilliant as you are. Take care of yourself." Olivia, I mailed it without expecting a reply, but a few weeks later, I received another package. This time it was a signed copy of his book. The inscription read, "To Olivia, for showing me the way back to myself." The words brought a lump to my throat, but they also filled me with a sense of peace. Life continued, as it always does. The memories of those months with Matthew remained with me, but they no longer felt like a weight I had to carry. Instead, they became a part of my story, a reminder of the complexities of love, loneliness, and the choices we make. I began to see the experience not as a mistake, but as a lesson. It had forced me to confront parts of myself I hadn't wanted to face. The depths of my loneliness, the yearning for connection, and the resilience I didn't know I possessed. And while it had hurt, it had also healed me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills, I thought about Matthew and wondered how he was doing. I imagined him sitting at his desk, pen in hand, pouring his thoughts onto the page with the same intensity and passion he had always possessed. I hoped he was happy. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that I was happy too. The garden was in full bloom that summer, a riot of colors and scents that seemed to celebrate the beauty of life itself. As I walked among the flowers, I felt a sense of contentment that had eluded me for so long. Life is messy and unpredictable, filled with moments of joy and pain, love and loss. But it's also beautiful, and I had learned to embrace it all, the good, the bad, and everything in between. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in a warm golden light, I smiled to myself, knowing that I was exactly where I needed to be.